G'day, welcome to the very first Good Tourism podcast episode. I acknowledge from the outset that the audio quality for this will be very bad, and I apologise for that. Please don't tear your ears off. With that said, I hope you enjoy this first effort. On the line, I'm with Professor Geoffrey Lipman. Geoffrey is former top brass at the International Air Transport Association, World Travel and Tourism Council, and the World Tourism Organisation. Currently, he is president at the International Council of Tourism Partners, professor and chief disruption architect at greenearth.travel, and co-founder of the SunX program. Geoffrey, thank you very much for taking the reputational risk of being the very first Good Tourism podcast guest.
It's a pleasure, David. I have no reputational risk left in my life.
Well, I very much appreciate you taking that risk anyway. Jeff, I understand much of your work these days is about linking transformative ideas such as green growth and travelism with practitioners in the field. Is that a good summation of what you're doing these days?
It's a good summation. I would add with two additional emphases. One is on trying to link the strategic policy with the tactical operational stuff. And the second one, and probably this becomes the most important one over time, is to try to find ways to engage with the next generation of people who will be the real leaders in this sector.
Okay, so yeah, we'll talk more about that a bit later. So the global organisations you worked with before, you know, the IATAs and the WTTCs and World Tourism Organisation, how good are they at connecting with and influencing the grassroots of the travel and tourism industry?
Well, I think they're pretty good, to be honest with you, because they've been doing it for a long time, and they've learned how to focus their efforts, and to some extent they've learned how to coordinate their activities. If I have a comment on the negative side, it's that they tend to listen to themselves, as we all do, I suppose. They tend to listen to themselves, and so much of what happens ends up being propaganda rather than seriously tested thought processes.
Would you have an example of that?
Well, I think the International Year of Sustainable Tourism for Development is a very good example.
Yep.
Where it has been, as far as I can see, a series of events which have followed the sponsorship-driven line, and largely with the same group of people with the same broad ideas dominating the exchanges, and the same kind of press releases which are then sent to the same kind of people.
So you think it's becoming a bit of an echo chamber at that sort of elite level?
I think it's a lobbying activity, and I understand that because I have been heavily involved over half a century in helping to put that institutional framework in place. But I think it's become to believe in itself too much. And, you know, there's always the talk about joining the silos, and I think we have silos now of the institutional framework, which is it's covered in this organization called GTAC, where the same group of people come together and in fact formulate a collective lobbying strategy. Mm-hmm. And then there's another group of people outside, somewhat disjointed, but who are pushing the envelope, I think.
And who would they be? Those that are pushing the envelope?
Names involve people like Harold Godwin, Anna Pollock, the ecotourism world in general, and then a massive number of people outside the sector who in many cases are much more advanced in their thinking and would be considered to be disruptive and radical for the people inside. And that's human nature. I'm analyzing it rather than criticizing it, if that makes any sense to you.
No, of course, yeah. I guess the industry and particularly those at the top need to be open to criticism, constructive criticism. Who better than Geoffrey Lipman to make those criticisms?
Well, I'm sure there's lots of people who are more committed and better placed, but I think I'm in an interesting place that I have helped to set up a lot of the industry positioning and lobbying activity. In IATA, for example, I was at the center of the reaction to US deregulation. In WTTC, I was the first employee, and for 10 years we had to build, the WTTC reports, the accounting systems, the public information provision, and the lobbying that went with it. And at UNWTO, the STEP program, the Davos Climate Declaration, and all that went with that. There's a lot of stuff that I've built and which is, I hope, a positive contribution. But when you're not inside, you see things from a somewhat different perspective.
Sure.
And I'm tired of listening to the same people singing the same song, to be honest with you. I think that's if there's a criticism, it's that more of these platforms need to engage with the people who have a different perspective, and because we have to change much more quickly than the institutional framework allows us to do.
That sounds like a Skype call coming in.
Yeah. I'll try and minimize those.
That's all right. That's all right. This will be a very raw and pretty much unedited podcast, so we'll keep it real, Geoffrey. which I think is your point with how the industry might handle these issues around sustainable tourism, responsible tourism, is to keep it real and get it out of the conferences and board tables and into the field. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, there's a dilemma out there for the organizations because it's easy to follow patterns, and we need patterns. That's part of the difficulty. But as I said before, there's a tendency to then believe yourself, and for what is presented as objective positioning to actually be lobbying. And, we started this aspect of the discussion around the International Year for Sustainable Tourism, and I'm afraid my observation is that much of it has been around positioning and lobbying.
At what point in your career did you personally start taking issues of sustainability and climate and green growth and that sort of thing seriously? Or who or what inspired you to think differently?
Well, I can see that as clearly as anything at this moment. It was 25 years ago. I'd just been appointed as the first president of the World Travel and Tourism Council. I was the only employee at that stage, and with a very small budget. And the message was from the half a dozen captains of industry, chairman and chief executives of the major corporations, get the message out that this is the world's largest industry and that it is the biggest creator of GDP and jobs and growth. And as we evolved that message, which we had to do very seriously with serious numbers and important sort of policy formulations, it became perfectly clear to me that we were running headlong into what was then a burgeoning green environment movement. and I started to look at this, and I went to my chairman at that time and said, look, we can't have a unlimited growth strategy. And the Rio Earth Summit was around the horizon in 1992, and he said, well, engage. So I went to see Maurice Strong, who was the person organizing that summit, the Secretary General, and a man who had been involved in sustainable development for 25 years already, with things like the Brundtland Commission and the Stockholm Environment Conference. One could say Maurice was one of the fathers of sustainable development. And I met with him in Geneva, discussed where the WTTC was headed, and we hit it off. And for the last 25 years, before Maurice died 2 years ago now, we spent a lot of time together, a lot of it in China towards the end of his life. And I just simply picked up on his philosophy that there's limits to growth, and we have to be able to manage our growth to respond to those limits. And I think I might have been the only travel and tourism person at Rio. I was immediately indoctrinated into a sustainable development mindset because everybody else there had it. And in fact, that's when it all really clicked for me. And we began to change our policies in WTTC. We did an Agenda 21 for travel and tourism immediately after the Earth Summit. I went to UNWTO at that stage and said, why can't we collaborate on this together? And we ran around the world kind of preaching a new sustainable growth philosophy. And that really has simply built over the years. Even with WTTC, we set up an environmental academic institute, and we started to look more deeply at this linkage between green and growth. And I carried on that philosophy through my time in UNWTO, and perhaps it became much more climate focused as we began to move into the Copenhagen COP meeting in 2009. And Francesco Frangeli, the then Secretary General of UNWTO, had a very strong view and a very positive view in my mind about the intersect between climate and tourism and weather. And he had established links with the World Meteorological Organization. So all of this has kind of contributed to where I am at the moment, which is climate has become the dominant issue on the green and sustainable landscape. And that's simply, as Maurice Strong said, because climate is existential for human beings. It's not for the planet. Maurice always said that, you know, he's not bothered about the planet. It takes care of itself, but it's the people that he worries about.
Yes.
And I think so many things can be seen to intersect with climate change, and it's so significant, and nature is so powerful, as we've seen recently in the Caribbean, that I decided that my last thing in life would be to put some focus on the intersect between climate and travel and tourism.
Right. Is that what travelism is? What is travelism? I know you're a proponent of that term.
Well, travelism came for a totally different reason, and
Okay.
you know, language is really important. And travelism emerged when I was in WTTC, and we wanted to get across the idea of travel and tourism being two distinct but interconnected elements of the same thing.
Yep.
And you know, the reality is that the institutional framework had never seen it that way. there were hospitality organizations, and there were transport organizations, and particularly aviation. IATA is a very strong and very professional organization. Mm-hmm. And there were tourism organizations. And the definition of tourism includes transport, includes hospitality, includes travel services.
Sure.
But it's very difficult to get that message across to people in the same way as it's difficult to get the message that business travel is an integral part of tourism. It's taken 10 years, to my mind, for even that message to be getting across. So travelism is simply an amalgam of travel and tourism. And the reason why I and others formulated this was because when you write travel and tourism in media releases, there's a copywriter who comes along and says, oh, too many words, we'll take one of them out. And so that, it was developed basically from that viewpoint. And when I was co-authoring some books in 2012 and 2014, I persuaded my fellow authors, in some cases reluctantly, to develop a concept of green growth and travelism. And travelism is just meant to include the entire travel and tourism supply and value chains.
I've always treated the word tourism as the industry at large, all those elements of the tourism industry, and travel being more the consumer side of things.
But if you were brought up as I was for 20 years in IATA, when tourism first began to emerge, and that's in the 1970s, we didn't like that very much in IATA because it meant low fares and mass travel and all of that kind of thing. And there is a huge distinction between the way that tourism has evolved relatively loosely with minimum international regulations. I mean, you can see that the first international convention as such is the Code of Ethics, which UNWTO has put in place this year. Well, IATA and ICAO and many institutional mechanisms around the world have been putting regulations in place and serious international regulations to govern the way that aviation operates, whether it's to do with the commercial side and the exchange of rights, and more importantly, to do with the safety side and the security side, because you've got people up in the air with at 30,000 feet with in metal cylinders. You have to be pretty careful about how you allow that to operate. So aviation has a much longer history and a much stronger set of institutional mechanisms than the broad tourism sector. So that's why it's very complicated, David.
For sure. Okay. I understand the International Council of Tourism Partnerships, which you are president of. Is that right?
Yes.
Green Growth Travel and the SunX program, they're all linked somehow. I think found Green Growth Travel, which in turn founded SunX. How does that all fit together?
It's not as beautiful as you describe, and the link is probably just because I'm a creative disruption architect and create organizations with colleagues.
Right.
So Green Earth Travel is simply an organization that I created when I had no longer any work in UNWTO to undertake sort of advisory work, consultancy work, and all of that. And frankly, it's just a small organization which doesn't have staff or major activity. ICTP is something that was put together really with Thomas Steinmetz and Alan Saint-Ange. Thomas Steinmetz being the publisher of eTurbo News, and Alan Saint-Ange, the former Minister of Tourism in the Seychelles. And we really were trying to create what I think now would be called a community of interest. And it's very much that. It's been a way of pulling together destinations and people interested from a destination viewpoint in green growth. I mean, I insisted that the purpose of the organization was to advance green growth, and it's got 700 or so members. It's basically run as a information and marketing network by Thomas Steinmetz, and I've certainly injected policy stuff into it. But the last couple of years, my focus has been on the Sun program, which is a separate entity, but it's linked. They're all linked, these organizations, and which is very practically focused on how to create a responsive system to climate change and how to bring travel and tourism into that framework in the same way that other sectors are doing this outside the framework. And so SunX is strategically a desire to put in place a network of prefabricated pop-up centers which are actually designed to be weatherproof, hurricane-proof now, and which are linked on the internet and manned by smart, bright young people who look for innovations in response to climate resilience.
Okay. So an example of a response to climate resilience, that one of these SunX, what would you call them? A unit, a pod, what would you call one of these centres?
We call them centres.
Centres.
The first one is going to go here in Belgium, in the province of Limburg, which is a very green province. Actually in this quarter, we're finalising the organisation of that now, and that will be a proof of concept. And what will happen is that bright people will come in and look on the internet for innovations. A smart city somewhere introduces a whole new system of urban transport. An island develops, with a loan from the World Bank, a new system of protecting a coastline or regrowing mangroves or helping to rebuild coral reefs. Sure. And the fact is there are so many of these things happening, some of which are identified as tourism, but some of which are just the normal development of the planet. Right. And we're trying to, we've built a web framework which we want to be a kind of library of this information. We want it to be very simple, the sorts of thing that people want to go and look at on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. And what we're trying to do is create a concept of lifetime learning about this, because it's changing all the time.
For sure. So the centre on the ground, say the one in was Limburg province, how many people staff the centre? And what do they do on a day-to-day basis? Do they go around talking to stakeholders? Do they work with the local university? I mean, what do they do on a day-to-day basis, and how do they engage with that locality?
Well, first of all, there isn't a magic bullet on this. There isn't one mechanism for dealing at the local level. Yep. And secondly, one has to think in terms of a 15-year evolution of the SDGs and a 35-year evolution of the climate framework. So, second point is this is going to change and evolve as we move forward if we can get the traction for it. And that's why we're putting a proof of concept center in Limburg, and we will, the people there, we expect to have one curator, as we call it, because most of the information is being developed by many other people. Griffiths University, for example, doing excellent work building a dashboard.
Yep.
The Travel Foundation, I've just read, is doing 4 islands, trying to look at a sort of climate resilience framework for 4 islands over 4 years. And there are going to be thousands and thousands of these.
Sure.
So what our centre is going to do is to try to identify some of the most relevant ones and work then as more centres come into play, there'll be more brains focusing on this. So in the end, if you could have one in every country with, and you asked how many people, one curator and a continual flow of smart, bright graduate trainees coming in from universities and from scholarships that we're trying to set up, then you would have the kind of structure that would be able to respond to what is a massive transformation of everything.
Right.
And you asked the question, some of the work they will do with the local community.
Sure.
Some of it will be with the local governance, which governance will differ, of course, from location to location, because that's the way the world is.
Right. You said that they would be like a pop-up, the prefab sort of buildings, pop up at a place. So presumably they would then, sit down for a few months, survey the area, then pick up and move on somewhere else. Is that?
It's not. It's maybe pop-up is the wrong word.
Okay.
We have a contractual relationship with a group of people who have been building steel-framed structures. I mean, things like oil rigs and and bridges, and they've developed the idea of a building which pops up out of a container.
Right, shipping container. Yep.
So you get a shipping container, and in a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 people would have put up a building which is large enough to, and it's all prefabricated. It's like an IKEA building, basically.
Sure.
And hopefully when you finish putting it up, you don't have a lot of screws left.
Right.
And it would hold, up to 150 people inside, have a huge screen that would be linked to a lot of other centres of the same kind. So you would have interactions between the centres, and you would have a wealth of information which is being curated. Some of that might be useful to universities, some of it might be used by local NGOs, some of it might be used by the local governance, and some of it, the centre might just end up being a place where you would show Al Gore's next movie and get the populations to start to make the kind of changes that I believe we are going to have to make if we are to avoid super dangerous climate change.
Okay. So hypothetically, if I'm right now in a little town called Walpole on the southwest tip of the Australian mainland, it's a small town of about 300 people, but it's surrounded by national parks, and there's a national marine park on the doorstep there with inlets and rivers flowing into the inlet system. Just hypothetically, if the local community or the local Parks and Wildlife Centre based here wants to do something along the SunX sort of model, how would they go about doing it? What sort of funding would they need to raise, if any? How would they get something off the ground?
Well, we would work with them, or they would work with us. We would, together with them, we would look for funding to make this happen. The basic cost of having a centre and having people in it and being part of the system, I would say, is between $60,000 and $100,000 a year.
Okay.
And that's with the asset being acquired over time, a bank coming into the process, one of the international financing institutions coming into the process, being able to tap into national climate resilience funds. That's a process that we would work on together. And in the end, this would be a local community-owned activity but working with us to make sure that it had all of the right technology, protocols, all the systems in place that would allow it to operate in a sort of devolved system, but that was following some very simple principles. And it may be that I should say something, if you're okay with that, about why we've developed this concept of impact travel.
Please.
Well, you get the center and you've got bright people, but what is it that you're tracking? And you know from the blog that there are so many different approaches to what is sustainable travel.
Sure.
And I've learned years ago, from my time in IATA, I've learned that you can't regulate things that are commercial down to the last detail.
No.
Markets don't function in that way. So we took a position that said that impact travel has to be kind of like a test that you could apply to sustainable travel, which everybody is defining in their own way.
Sure.
And it has three components. The first one is that the good and the bad things are being measured. Mm-hmm. So you can manage them coherently. And how they're measured, there's going to be dozens and hundreds of different ways around the world of measuring. But at least if people are measuring and they're doing this over time, and they're looking at what might be the negative impacts as well as the positive impacts, and they're honestly trying to say, we can't advance this if we don't get some balance between them, that for us is one of the three pillars of impact travel.
Sure.
The second pillar is the activity clearly has to look at green growth. It has to be low carbon focused. It has to be inclusionary in terms of all of the population benefiting, the locals benefiting as much as the travel companies, all those issues. Mm-hmm. It has to use the new technology, and above all, it has to focus on biodiversity and resource conservation. So where you are for a national park, I mean, this is the lifeblood of what the travel and tourism experience is. But and Gloria Guevara, the new president of WTTC, recently I saw that she said that, it's about planning. It's not just about initiating ideas, it's about planning for them.
Sure.
And then the third component, so the first is it has to be measured, the second is it has to have green growth, and the third thing is it has to be what I call 2050 proof. Mm-hmm. And that means that it has to, on the one hand, tie itself into the Paris climate targets, because that's the only road we have to solve this problem. And secondly, it has to plug into all of the incredible new technology which is going to change our life, and which I think is best being captured by what the World Economic Forum calls a fourth industrial revolution. And if you look at the forum's website, there's so much information there. Anybody who's plugged into the internet and is guided in the right way would be able to find things which are relevant to them.
Sure.
So you would get your center, you'd spend, maybe $60,000, not Australian dollars, American dollars a year. And you would have a cadre of 3 or 4 people, but there would obviously be more because you'd have universities and students and NGOs engaged in this, and you would be linked to a growing group of like-minded people all over the world.
Right.
And you'd do whatever it is that social entrepreneurs do with each other. And if I can make this point, time is such an important element in our adaptation to something as massive and dramatic as climate impact. The people who set up the Paris Convention, who were the same people who tried to do it in Copenhagen 6 years earlier and did the WSSD in Johannesburg and Rio plus 20. I mean, it's the same group of people formulating a philosophy that says we must manage our future so that we grow, but in a way which is green. And those people would be linked and growing over time. I mean, I believe they'll grow over time. And so the 15 years for the SDGs and the 35 years for the climate accords, if you look back in history, that's the equivalent of the last 100 years, because time, the pace of change, according to Alvin Toffler, is accelerating. So 1 year now is the equivalent to 2 or 3 years in the past. And that's why I'm optimistic. If you say we start with one center, there may be 10 in 3 years' time, there may be 100 in 15 years' time. You'll have a network and a movement which is trying to move us in the right direction without saying the planes have to stop flying.
Sure.
Which is nonsense.
Yes. All the information curated by the SunX centers, that's freely available to anybody who wants to access it, yeah? In terms of...
well,
right?
Nothing lives free of charge in this world. But I do have a philosophy about this, and I'm really glad you asked that question, because I'm pretty bad at developing commercial things, Green Globe, the environmental center we did at WTTC. At the end of the day, you need to have a source of income.
Sure.
So our system is very simple. We've created a membership of SunX. And by the way, the X is just there to remind everybody it's existential. Climate change is existential. We added it over the last year because SUN stands for the Strong Universal Network, for strong. So we added the X, and we said there's a one-time, lifetime membership fee, and it's 100 euros. And that's it. And if you keep growing the membership, you'll have enough funds to run a small entrepreneurial organization which is helping to manage this process. And then the information is available forever.
Sure.
And we're trying to manage this building of funds. We've created a scholarship program, and there we've said that we will enroll 21 students if we can find industry partners who will put up 5,000 euros to be linked with 21 students. And 3,000 of the 5,000 euros is going to go to a scholarship for one student, to create an incentive for people to want to go into a competition, write a 2,000-word essay on impact travel.
Right.
And then we'll select one, and 21 will become lifetime learning people who will be linked with a company whose corporate social responsibility ethos says, yes, I think that's a good way for me to engage in this world. So we're just starting that process at the moment.
It sounds very interesting. When will the Lindbergh Center be up and running?
Well, my hope is that it's going to be operational in the first, we're going to put it in place in the last quarter of this year, and it's going to become operational in the first quarter of next year.
Okay.
I'm always loath to talk about exact timings because we have to do things like satisfy local building conditions and all of those issues. But we seem to be on track for this, and that's what we're hoping to do.
So at some point, people who want to access the output of that center can sign up, I guess, on the Sun website and pay the 100 euros, and they're in, and they can access the output from Lindbergh and any other center that pops up in the future. Is that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. And I guess mostly run by volunteers and students, yeah?
Every place, this is conjecture from me, but I've been involved with academia now for the last 20 years of my life. I'm a visiting professor at Victoria University in Melbourne,
Mm-hmm.
and here at Hasselt University and at Ljubljana University. I've actually in Slovenia. Last year we ran an impact. Well, it was an environmental management course with a lot of impact travel in it for 35 master's students.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've learned from this time is that there's a huge potential for volunteerism. There's a huge potential for linking this kind of thinking into academic training, into school leaver training, into graduate trainees.
Yeah.
And we're exploring that. I have a network at the moment of about 15 universities who we're talking to, and an organization here in Brussels, which has 800 business schools linked to it. So we're hoping that if we can build some partnerships, we'll be able to find whatever formulation of interest in the sun centers you get from a particular university. As I keep saying, my experience is this differs from country to country, from city to city. You know, your own community is going to look at things very differently from how they look at them in Melbourne.
Absolutely. There's going to be different priorities and problems and solutions for every particular locality, right?
Absolutely.
Yep.
And that's the big challenge, because most of what you see in the media is looking at big picture global solutions, which we need, but then they have to be translated at the local level.
Sure.
And you know, a sun center in your area might end up becoming a sun center for Western Australia. I mean, you don't know until somebody comes along and says, wow, that's neat. What would it take for us to get one? And there's a local philanthropist who says, yeah, sure, I'll endow one.
Excellent. It sounds like a very, very interesting project, and I wish you all the best with it. Geoffrey, we've recorded nearly an hour already. I know you're a very busy guy. I'm sure we could talk about many other things, this and many other things, for a lot longer. But I'll do our listeners a favour, because you know the ears are probably bleeding at this point.
So they're probably sleeping.
No, I don't think they are. Thank you very much for your time. How can people find you online and contact you, Geoffrey?
Well, we have, like everybody, we have a website. It's www.thesunprogram.com, and that's the American formulation of program. So it's THESUNPROGRAM, and you can get me, you know, through the website and
Yep,
all
you're
of
on
the.
LinkedIn. You're on LinkedIn and Twitter.
I'm on. Yes, I'm on all of those.
Yep.
I have I have a Facebook account, but I only use it for expressing my disgust at Donald Trump.
Yeah, I've noticed that, and perhaps we can talk about Donald Trump on another podcast sometime.
I think the less one talks about Donald Trump, the better the world would be.
Well,
But I can't help it.
sure. Well, I think he's a symptom of deeper problems. But yeah, again, we can probably talk about that some other time.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, our listeners can find links to this podcast on goodtourismblog.com, along with written GT insights contributed by academics, experts, and practitioners. My vision for the Good Tourism blog is to offer insightful news and views free of charge to everyone, unlike the Sun expert. So whether you're a student, a guest house manager, a tour guide, or a tenured academic, a leading consultant, or a C-level executive, any stakeholder can come to the Good Tourism blog and obtain that content. Now the question is, as you rightly brought up earlier, Geoffrey, if all that content is free, how can the GT blog and podcast survive? Well, I trust that those who can afford to will step up to support the blog and pod, and there are a few ways they can do that. Individuals who appreciate GT can support it via Patreon. There are some nice little benefits on offer depending on the level of patronage. Organisations who appreciate GT can sponsor it, And now would be a good time, as the rates I set when I first launched the blog in May, they're at the same level. And hopefully this podcast with you, Geoffrey, will see a greater audience very quickly.
Well,
Organisations.
David, all I should say as we sign off is you're considerably more innovative than I am in your commercialization. At the end of the day, we're both trying to provide a service, I think, for a better way of life. And hopefully we'll both find people who find it interesting enough that they will help us keep doing it.
For sure. No, certainly, I like you, I kind of want to connect the dots between what's talked about at conferences to what happens on the ground. And my only expertise really is putting together content and putting it on the internet. But tourism. I've worked in tourism, and I find it interesting, and it really is a fascinating, diverse industry.
Well, I think what you're doing is a really great contribution, and I'm not just saying that because you interviewed me. We need to have more, as you put it, good information out there, but we need to also be realistic about the bad stuff that's going on.
For sure.
And I think in that sense, we're both on the same page. And I can say this, we will be very happy to promote the Good Tourism blog somewhere within the framework of the Sun program, David. I think you're doing a good job.
Well, thank you very much. A couple of other ways organisations can support the GT blog. Event partnership. I've certainly had experience covering events, finding angles, writing press releases and event reports and that sort of thing. I can certainly do that with my GT blog hat on and find the good tourism angles happening at your event and report on those and cover them in the blog, obviously. I'm also available for project work at friendly rates, so that I can start to pay some bills while continuing to produce the blog and the pod, of course. And anybody, of course, like and share GT content with friends and colleagues. Professor Geoffrey Lipman, thank you very, very much for joining me on this what must be an ear-bleeding experience for our listeners in terms of audio quality, but very interesting, I'm sure, for them.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.